You're listening to Depth Perception, supported by our patrons on Patreon. Today we're doing The Time Machine by H.G. Wells, written in, I think, 1895. This book is an early entry it's I think the first entry in like the sort of the modern science fiction time travel subgenre.
It's certainly like the preeminent sci-fi novel.
And it's also it set the tone for sci-fi as a genre in many ways too.
It's like up there with like just the War of the Worlds in terms of influence. Also, of course, by H.G. Wells.
Right. Also, exactly. So, what I want to do here is talk about the plot and avoid just going into way too much detail. So, real quick, you should go read it. What's anything graphic in this that I want to warn people about? There's some killing of maybe human creatures.
I'll touch back on this later, but the storyteller really seems to delight in the battering of Morlocks.
Of the Morlocks. He definitely also, there's things that he says that reveal him to be a racist, probably like a phrenologist or some shit, you know. So I'm talking about the Time Machine, his perspective, right? The H.G. Wells is basically, well, let's think. I kind of think of H.G. Wells as the point of view character, even though he has a different name in the book. I think his name's Hillier. So he's this young guy who's going to these meetings of these people with just interesting curiosities, of like the weird and like sort of edge science, I guess pseudoscience, basically things that are maybe not quite yet science. It's just like educated people, but of slightly varying social classes.
I kind of imagine it like a Moose Lodge or something.
Okay. Yeah, but it's unofficial, you know, it's loose.
A club of esotericists.
Yeah, and the time traveler is the person whose house they're in. The time traveler is an aristocrat. He has butlers and shit, and money to pursue his research privately. So that's going on. That's sort of the backdrop. At one meeting, the guy comes in, the would-be time traveler, introduces to the group of people that happen to be there that night, because it's not always the same people. They don't know what they're going to get. They get this story about this invention that he has that is a machine that travels through time. The exposition gives a really cool sort of analogy of, you know, a two-dimensional plane to a three-dimensional cube, and then going from the cube to like, what about in four dimensions? Sort of a like a layman's four-dimensional geometry, and proceeds from there, kind of does the job of explaining the basic idea of time travel so that every other time travel story ever written since doesn't have to. And and yet they do. And we have the commentary of the various people who are identified by profession, mostly at the table. And we get then the historical, we get the account of, oh my God, I missed something, right? So then they all go away that night. They're like, oh my God, did that model that he made of the time machine really disappear into time? Was it a trick? Whatever. They come back a week later, expecting those of them that returned, including our narrator, of course, are expecting a story perhaps about a guy who successfully traveled through time, because he had said to them that he was going to try to do that in the intervening week. He's not there at first. He comes in extremely disheveled. And the people who were there last week are like, oh my God, have you been time traveling? Yes, whatever. And they have dinner. He tells the story. The story is this. He goes forward in time, sitting in his study. Eventually, everything around him disappears as it speeds up. He basically is watching. It's funny because the intervening years from when this was written have really improved our ability to imagine some of the descriptions. Specifically, the time-lapse nature, like, of what he's seeing. We've seen time-lapse film. Like, you know, I've seen Koyaanisqatsi. I know what it looks like to watch, I don't know, the sun speed up around the earth, you know, nature in fast motion. So you get a lot of descriptors of, like, trees swelling and then falling and decaying over and over as the years are going by in seconds and stuff. And then he just kind of guns it, and he goes to the year 802,701, lands in what is basically the same spot, gets out, is immediately greeted by these small cuties known as Eloi. Later we find out they're like utopia. He interprets it, the time traveler, who again is a bourgeois guy, interprets this as, oh my god, communism. These people are like, they're good, they live in these great garments. It's basically the Garden of Eden. There's a sphinx behind him. There's ancient statues. There's no animals. Every plant seems edible, or at least non-toxic. Apparently there's no bacteria. There's nothing that could possibly harm people. No diseases, you know.
He gets into it later more. They've settled into, like, they've found comfort in domesticity, and they've pretty much eliminated all of their natural problems.
Yes. So he's like, this is great, even if they're... But he also keeps thinking, he has this, like, liberal, competitive worldview of, like, okay, like, well, it's because they don't have struggle anymore. They don't care. They have no attention spans. They don't care about anything that he's saying. They have no grasp on whatever the science was that got them to this state. So he can't really interact with them. And he has a very, like, kind of colonial, like, like amateur anthropologists, you know, view of them, right? And so he goes around with them. He eats fruit. He learns a few nouns in their language. Later, he saves one of them from drowning, and none of the other ones seem to care. Her name's Weena, and I guess another little disclaimer here. It's a little bit creepy, the relationship that he has with Weena, because he's not sure what age she is, because everyone looks kind of what's the word? So everyone's kind of neotenous. They both, like, mature extra quickly, it seems, but also, like, don't really look fully adult when they're grown. So she's kind of childlike, and he doesn't really think that she's anywhere near as
it's
old
kind of
as...
like, yeah, it kind of felt like how a cat kind of looks the same the whole time.
Yeah, it's a little pedophilic, some of the undertones of it, but she's also kind of like his daughter, even though there's an element of flirtation. It's very strange.
That's what I was gonna say. It's got kind of like a weird, like, surrogate daughter thing where it's like,
Yeah.
well, we're not related by blood.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You said it.
It kind of felt weird. Definitely dated in terms of, like, social norms and stuff.
I mean, of course, the way out of this is that it's not H.G. Wells telling the story. It's a guy it's an aristocrat. A guy who we would be critical of is telling the story. So anything he says, you know.
So that's one thing I wanted to hit on earlier, actually, was the storytelling device or whatever, that it's kind of epistemological almost. It's like it's treated as like an account firsthand by the person that experienced it. It's very cool. It's treated like a primary source.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Or I suppose a secondary source of the world, because it's being relayed to us by a second narrator.
That's true. Yeah. It's
both.
It's funny that we talked about documentaries today when this is kind of presented as a documentary.
Yeah, totally. Good point. Yeah. And so we have this narrator who's got a lot of class and race biases and is moving through this world trying to figure it out. Thinks it's communism. Later, eventually he starts to see things that don't add up. He sees out of the corner of his eye small white creatures from a distance. He realizes that the Eloi are extremely afraid of the dark. He notices that there isn't really any social use of fear. You know, they have a behavior, which is go inside at night, especially on very dark nights when there's no moon. Don't go out, you know, sleep when it's dark, do nothing else. But they don't really have any response when something bad happens in front of them. You know what I mean? Like, fear is almost... They have fear, but they don't have any level of... They haven't a wit sufficient to develop any kind of response to that fear that will help them. Because when they're presented with challenges, normally... It's just like one. If you're only challenged for hundreds of thousands of years, the idea is that, like, every once in a while somebody drowns, you know, but no one gets attacked by animals or whatever. The idea is that from the time machine operator's perspective, like, there's not really a need for fear because that was just that there was nothing that could have been done to change that situation. I don't know. Maybe I don't think that's right, but I think it's basically the perspective of the time traveler. It's a very, like, kind of individualist kind of worldview that he has, or subtly at least. maybe I'm over interpreting too, or just kind of like not quite right interpreting.
So sometimes I wonder when like social commentary started being in like new genres, you know.
You mean in like something like fantasy?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder if that was like something that it was considered at the time.
I wonder if it was something that was always there, or always could be there, or if it's something that, because it could be true that just like the really good ones had it. You know what I mean?
Right. What I'm driving at is that, like, you know, you read Tolkien and everybody's like, oh, it's about the First World War, and Tolkien's like, no, it's a story. I'm just wondering whether certain kinds of texts, you know, in the infancy of their genre, were written with the intention of being understood, you know,
Yeah.
socially.
Right. Like was H.G. Wells like pioneering in that regard?
Yeah.
Or not?
It just kind of seems like stuff like this isn't meant to be understood in that way. It's not meant to be analyzed in that way.
This is explicitly. This is like well understood as
is that so?
explicitly
okay.
a socialist.
Yeah. Okay. I don't know about H.G. Wells like that, so I'm speculating, I guess.
What was I gonna? So just to pick up on the narrative, let me speed this up a little bit because it is taking a bit longer than I wanted.
For a short story, it's pretty fucking long.
Yeah. So it's a full novella for sure. It's the right name for it, I think.
It's not a short story, yeah.
You told me Mountains of Madness was a novella, and the recording I found was 19 hours long. So
there is not
something like
19-hour.
Okay,
that's somebody. That's
hours.
somebody reading it like 8 times.
Maybe it was 9 hours.
It's like
Maybe
7 chapters. That book is not that much.
Okay, there's some kind of discrepancy here. Okay, so basically the next thing that happens after he's sort of been observing them is that he figures out that there are. Oh, he notices. Okay, no. So the next thing that happens is he notices that his time machine is gone. So he freaks out. He's pretty mean to the Eloi and stuff, and they don't know anything, and they're scared of him, and they can't really understand him anyways. And so eventually he figures out that he has to go down into the Morlocks' holes. He figures out there are other creatures there, right? That are, I think he sees one of them even above ground and kind of gets the idea, oh man, and realizes that the holes in the ground that he thought were wells, shout out to H.G. Wells maybe, I don't know, are actually entryways.
Meta commentary.
Yeah, the author inscribes himself in the work.
Like Stephen King.
So he goes down into one of these holes in the ground on this flimsy ladder and finds a little chute off of it. Has no idea what happens if he falls because it seems to just go on. But he finally takes a left or something like that. You know, takes a side route, goes into this tube and sees dimly with the light of his match. Which, by the way, the Eloi love the matches. They've never seen fire except for with lightning, I guess. So he brings the match in and he sees dimly these Morlocks, these creatures that are like, they look like this, they sound like Gollum basically, and they're eating red meat, and he smells the smell of blood, and he assumes immediately this is the Eloi. I think with pretty good reason that the Eloi are being eaten by these creatures. Although he hasn't actually seen any Eloi being taken, so it's possible they have another source of red meat, yada yada. He basically barely escapes because they all try to grab him, and then he gets up the shit out of there, and thus begins, I think, his quest, right? He takes Weena to this building that he sees off in the distance, which turns out to be an ancient ruined museum, which is one of the coolest image-wise, I think, parts of the book. But I don't know if
it was a really cool set piece.
Yeah. And he finds a crowbar and some more matches, and what does he do? He's trying to bring Weena back with him, but he gets stuck in the forest at night and the Morlocks are coming. He accidentally lights the entire forest on fire, gets out. Weena does not get out, and even though he saved her, and then only to cause her death again.
I don't know about save.
Well, he saved her from drowning.
Okay, yeah.
And then she liked him a lot, and then he, instead of being like, this is weird, he was like, okay, fine.
It's like, I don't know, it's just like when Frodo picked up Gollum or something.
Yeah.
And Nausicaa found the cat.
So then he gets on the hill and sees the fire burning, and a lot of Morlocks died, and he's really, really happy about that, and seems to excuse Weena's death partly on that basis. He basically is like, oh, it's better that she died in that fire than in being eaten by those Morlocks. Like, fuck you, dude, personally. It's kind of one of these moments where, like, this guy hates poor people so much that he thinks it's better to die in a fire than to be, like, killed by a poor person, is essentially the vibe that I got, which, just a weird distinction to make.
Yeah, it's a weird thing to think about. It's not the same as saying I'd rather drown than be set on fire.
Exactly. Can you imagine if that's what it was? Would you rather be killed in fire or be killed by just a band of hungry poor people?
Person, yeah. Pitchfork peasants, yeah.
The perennial dilemma, right? Okay, so he gets back to the home area, and he's really tired because he's been hiking all morning or whatever, and he sleeps a little bit, gets ready to gets up at around sunset. Now he's confident that he's not gonna fall asleep at night and be eaten by the Morlocks. So he's in a good position, basically. He has his crowbar, and he has a bunch of extra matches, which he hasn't had to use yet. He sees in front of him the Sphinx, which was next to his machine, and which he assumes the machine is inside. He sees the door is open. He gets to the Sphinx, pops into the doorway, knows that they're trying to ambush him. He has that instinct. He goes to light one of the matches. The match is a strike-on. I loved this. The match is a strike-on box, so he can't light the match. So he climbs onto the time machine, battling these Morlocks off. Almost loses one of his levers to the time machine, which is needed to activate it. Gets on. By the way, they've oiled the time machine, which is a clear sign of intelligence, but even then he finds a way to dismiss them as just contemptible fools. He's like, oh, in their dim way, they took it apart. Like, clearly the Morlocks are way smarter than anyone here. I don't know. But again, so he gets on the machine, turns the lever, gets the heck out of there, goes forward instead of backward in time by accident, says, hey, what the hey? And when he lands, he sees like some giant crab people or something, and then he goes forward and there's more crab people, and he goes forward so far that there's just moss, and the sun is larger now, and then he's like, okay, that's enough, and he goes home. So then you get another meeting. You go back to the present time, right? The meeting, and he's finishing the story, and everyone's kind of like, wow, what the shit, that was pretty crazy, and leaves. And the guy, what's his name, says like, I want to come back and talk to you about this or something. And so he does. And as he's entering the time traveler's house, he sees the machine disappearing in the room where he keeps it. And no one's seen except for him. And it's been 3 years now, and no one knows where the time machine is or the time traveler. The end, essentially.
Yeah. Okay. So suddenly I have more to talk about than I did before. There was like some decent horror in this. At least that one instance that I remember, which was he's talking about like pawing around for the match, and he can't get it to light because it's strike-on box. And he's talking about like he can feel the hands like on his legs and on his back and around his neck and everything, and like that was really good. I was really that's probably the thing that I was most impressed about.
Good fucking story.
Well,
good suspense.
Good moment. I thought that was a really effective moment of horror. I think I'm learning about myself that horror gets me more in books than it does in other mediums.
Gotcha.
I mean, video games are the worst because it's interactive, and I suppose real life would probably be pretty bad too.
But then it wouldn't be horror.
Yeah, I'd be horrified.
Fair. I think that's what distinguishes terror from horror.
Yeah.
Terror is when it's real.
Yeah, could be. So Fire and Lightning. What was the thing about Fire and Lightning? I'm struggling to remember. I thought it was really cool, and I had something about it, but you'll have to say it again.
Did I say something about fire and lightning?
Yeah. Well,
that they hadn't seen fire except for perhaps lightning.
Okay. So do you remember, Benny? Do you remember way back when we recorded our shared mythology, and we were talking about fire?
Yeah.
How like fire might have been like the big. I mean, obviously it was like kind of the point of change in humanity. Assuming
One of them, yeah.
I mean,
in a way, it was the change, but in another way, language was the change.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What I'm driving at is that it's one of a couple moments, and I was talking. I feel like I talked about like, what haven't we lost fire now? Like, fire making isn't really a skill that people have. Certainly, fire keeping is not really a skill people have. I mean, people throw plastic on fire. Fire is something that we're kind of out of touch with, and yet it still has this primal thing for us. I mean, there's no feeling that's the same as sitting around a bonfire.
Yeah, I've never made fire straight from the earth. I've never made a fire from scratch. I've always used a mix.
No, one thing I mean to do this summer is learn like the bow thing.
Yeah.
You have like a hearth board and
totally
you start a fire with a stick. I don't know why it's called a bow. I mean, it always just looks like a stick, but
you should do it. That's really cool.
It doesn't seem like it's that hard. I mean, you need some materials and stuff, but that's not the point. It's I don't know. I was just interested again by I don't think somebody in 1895 or whatever imagined that fire was something that had like the level of impermanence that it does, that it'd be lost so quickly. 100 years ago, everybody knows how to make a fire, no matter what, because that's how you light the stove.
Right. Everybody knows
today,
at least what today is the thing that only a few people know, whereas like it's become like a rare skill again. It's become like an actual skill. Like building a fire is today what I think probably making a fire back then from like flint and wood would have been. Like making a spark, you know what I mean?
That's what I'm saying. It's so interesting that in this story he imagines that as like a side effect of 800,000 years of progress, or at least in terms of time.
And there's a couple times when he says things when the time traveler, who I think the blog post that I had you read from, what's his name, Mark Gorshin or something like that.
I tried, but you called me when I was reading.
Okay.
So
that post like talks about
I still have
the two levels of bias, the bias of the aristocrat time traveler and the bias of the socialist Wells stand-in, Hillier. Hillier, how he's like, a lot of the more communist stuff might have been overemphasized, but I don't think that's and even the blogger acknowledges that might not be the case. But it seems like that this time traveler is basically a rich social democrat. Like maybe he's a liberal, but he thinks communism might be inevitable, whether or not he wants it to happen, right? And he talks about like the lessening of sexual dimorphism, the diminishing of sexual dimorphism as being directly related to what were then current trends, division of labor going away. He talks about things that like are already happening, and they're happening self-consciously, not because of the way I would say it is a lot of the things that he talks about as happening needing to happen over hundreds of thousands of years are literally happening in generations.
It took a century.
Yeah, including the real prospect of capitalism eating the world and destroying any semblance of what is recognizable as humanity. Because really, even if at first the Eloi seem like the descendants of humanity, to know that they're only descendants of specific aspects of what is considered human right now kind of changes that.
This is why I suggested that you pay particular attention to chapter 13.
Yeah, the exposition dialogue at the very beginning of that was great.
The
article that I sent you quoted part of it too.
Yeah, well, when I was making my little notes, I was like, oh, that's a good sentence. I should write that down so we can talk about that. And then the next sentence I was writing down, and it got to the point where I was like, oh, well, I'm gonna have to write the whole fucking chapter if I do this, so I'll just stop. I'm sure it stopped. I'm sure it only lasted for a couple paragraphs, but there's some pretty good stuff I'm gonna read that later.
Word. Randy, I just had a thought. I wrote down a lot of stray thoughts here. I don't want to read my stray thoughts in the major episode. I want this to just be more like us having the conversation that we're already having, and then do an appendix that's just a buzz through of like some of the less
Okay.
specifically, like, because some of the things I just like I don't need to go into like all the quotes I wrote down. You know
Yeah,
what I mean?
I mean, yeah, I wrote down much less than you, but I've still got a couple like things that I think we could probably just rip off. And
Yeah.
I don't think it's important that we talk about whether or not this story started people saying Eureka. I've never heard it used earnestly anywhere else besides this story.
Wow, that to me seems like a thing that only, or like a Victorian prick, like the time traveler, might do.
Yeah.
Or one of his friends.
Yeah. So since I've got a lot less than you, why don't you touched while you were going through the plot on just about everything I've written down except for that. So I'll keep going through. So I think we said what we need to say about fire. Let's jump back to the beginning because this is another one you specifically touched on. It really got my gears turning when he talked about how because you can render a three-dimensional image in 2D space, that you should therefore be able to do the same with 4 dimensions in 3D space, and it's just a matter of figuring it out. Just a matter of figuring out how to visualize it.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, I mean that's different in 3D
Right.
space, and I mean it's not just about. It's not like a rival where we can just project an image, but yeah.
It made me think about models of tesseracts that I've seen. Have you ever seen it? Have you ever seen those? Like,
No, I have no idea what.
a tesseract is like a 4-dimensional cube.
Oh well, then maybe
Watch, like, you can see like a GIF of one.
I'm thinking of the word tessellate. Oh yeah, I've definitely seen this.
People have also built like little models of them in different, because it doesn't have one shape, right? Like it can be displayed in different ways when it's in 3D. It's a 3-dimensional shadow, they say.
Yeah. I'm definitely thinking of the word tessellate, which now I know what it means. Okay. Yeah, I don't know. That was just something really imaginative. I wasn't expecting. It happened so early in the book. Really set expectations that didn't end up being met. I mean, I didn't hate the book, but that kind of set me up for something I wasn't really going to get. One thing about this is that it's not hard sci-fi. This is very, very soft sci-fi. It's closer to sci-fantasy than it's more like Star Wars than it is like Arrival.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, can I pose a question to you, or were you about to?
Pose a question to me.
Well, this is relevant here too. Time travel fiction, right? Like, is this story the Lord of the Rings of future time travel fiction? Do you know what I mean?
I do know what you mean. I have trouble placing it because the only sci-fi fiction I've ever really paid attention to, aside from like when I can't avoid it, like in, I mean, all kinds of things.
You mean specifically time travel or just sci-fi?
Yeah, time travel is like a very specific contrivance. I don't think this. I don't think this does that for sci-fi. I would struggle to think. Like I kind of almost feel like it took until like Asimov to do sci-fi.
Oh, interesting.
I could be wrong. I'm not like a sci-fi guy in that way. But the only real time travel stuff I ever got into was Doctor Who, and it's like, I mean, they invented the word timey-wimey for a reason. It's like pure nonsense.
To warn you?
Yeah, it's just like time travel to me. I just hate. I don't know. I like it because Doctor Who is like a fun show, but I don't know. I just don't know enough about like sci-fi and time travel to say whether this was the. I wouldn't be surprised if it was, but I have to. I almost feel like War of the Worlds is more of that.
I was specifically talking about time travel though.
Okay,
to be clear, yeah.
Time travel, it definitely could be. I don't see a lot of I mean, there's some of this in Doctor Who, but yeah, I don't really know. I've never seen Back to the Future, for example.
Well, something just occurred to me. Listen to this, right? Like, maybe what I'm really asking is, are you as ignorant as I am about time travel fiction?
Like I said, I've never even seen Back to the Future.
Because after all, our whole assertion that like Lord of the Rings is like unsurpassed in fantasy, what I mean by that isn't like
easy.
It's literally the book. It's more, I mean, it is in many ways unsurpassed, but a lot of the ways in which it's unsurpassed, I'm kind of imagining simply because I haven't actually read a lot of fantasy. So I don't want to overgener. Well, let me. I don't want to overgeneralize that on that point, right? Like, and the same thing here. I think that there's something in this time travel story that is like unique, and maybe there's aspects of it that probably haven't been improved upon. But I wouldn't be as confident saying that if I read. I have a feeling if I read more time travel fiction, I would be like, well, what about this counterexample? You know, what about this story? What about that?
So I have some thoughts on this that I've had for a while. If you watch something like, if you've never heard of Lord of the Rings and you watch Game of Thrones and then you read Lord of the Rings, or you watch Lord of the Rings, you're gonna be like, this shit is so stupid compared to Game of Thrones. Where's all the sex? Um, I think when we're very far separated from the contemporary time of when something came out and set the framework, we begin to think of it as run of the mill, when we have to understand that it is the mill. Right?
That's great. Yeah, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
So that is, in that sense, I feel like this is what Lord of the Rings is in that particular sense.
where's the time travel before this?
This is the mill.
Yeah. The only fantasy that even resembles what modern fantasy looks like, which is like gritty and like kind of lame and like really shitty, and nothing good really ever comes out anymore. The closest it gets is like the King of Elfland's Daughter. I think that's like and it's still not really the same as what we have now, which is like Tolkien invented everything that we have in fantasy.
Tolkien basically invented a mythological space. It's kind of like what Borges was talking about in the Ton Uqbar Orbis Tertius, where like in that case a secret society intentionally invents like a whole fantasy world of a fake country, whereas Tolkien did it because he just hit on something. He opened a space.
So it's pretty far across the room. I'd go get it so I could tell you what it says, what it is. But I have a book by Clark Ashton Smith that I was going to begin reading tonight because I got through fellowship, and it's like weird fantasy, I guess, is what I understand of it anyway. He was a contemporary of Lovecraft. He was like a favorite writer of Lovecraft's. So I'm assuming it's not going to really be what I expect of fantasy. See, Game of Thrones, right, is something I would call a hard fantasy. Where I would not call this a hard sci-fi.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah. Lord of the Rings is a hard fantasy, but it's also nothing like Game of Thrones.
They both exist they both basically are subgenres of what I would call Tolkien fan fiction, which is basically, in specific case of fantasy, I think that the normative fantasy book is basically an example of Tolkien fan fiction. It's just that fan fiction, in particularly like that world, has become so, like, it's so, of course, fan fiction, of course, we usually think of people using the same characters and stuff like that, and there's very little of that in fantasy, but you don't have to. The thing that Tolkien did was he fleshed out so much detail. He created such a rich world that it's like fan fiction about, on the level of like the production of the characters.
Well,
rather,
like,
you know what I mean?
You ever think about how, like, especially with fan fiction, like, people have written more about, I don't know, say, like, an example I've heard before is Harry Potter. People have written more Harry Potter than J.K. Rowling. You know, fan fiction is a really interesting thing. I would love to know what a guy like H.G. Wells, like, he would probably consider other time travel stuff fan fiction.
I wonder.
Yeah.
Whereas then you have somebody like Lovecraft who opened up his world to other people to directly write in, which I think is pretty interesting and cool.
So, did you like the way that this book handled time travel? Because I'm usually very badly annoyed by it. But I didn't let myself get there because I knew that this is the first instance of time travel in fiction or anything that I've ever heard of. Except for, like, Saint Germain and stuff, but...
Here's why I thought it was good. There's always going to be problems with time travel, and I think that's related to the fact that it can't really exist in any way that we can currently conceptualize it. You know what I mean? So you're always going to be, like, bumping up against, like, just flat contradictions. Like, the thing about moving through time being like the spokes on a bike wheel moving really quickly so that they don't interact. Like, it's extremely poetic and cool, but if you actually tried to give it the same level of, like, metaphorical, like, rigorous analysis of that metaphor as you did with the metaphor of the cube, of the 2D space being recorded in 3 and therefore imagining the 3D space being recorded in 4. I said that backwards, the 3D in 2 and the 4D in 3. Anyways, if you give it that level of rigor, it probably doesn't really hold up. It's pretty arbitrary. But it adds a flavor. It adds, like, a cool flavor. And because H.G. Wells does something that most people don't, which is specifically explain sort of the give a conceptual grounding to time travel in a particular way that is completely left out of something like Back to the Future, where it's taken for granted. You know what I mean? Like, how it's taken for granted that, like, it should be possible to imagine somebody moving through time in a story like that. Whereas H.G. Wells does not take it for granted. And that's what really sells it for me, is that he gives you that idea and he brings you back to it multiple times. And he also, I think, in a couple instances, even makes metaphorical references to it indirectly in a cool, poetic way, which maybe we'll talk about that in the appendix, because I wrote it down in that. I wrote a note about it. Oh, how about you?
Again, I just was not super impressed by the vast majority of this story. It hasn't really stuck to my ribs like that.
Well, the thing about this that's also different from, like you said, the Tolkien stuff is that this didn't become commonplace.
Part of the problem is I hate the narrator. He's such an asshole.
He is a huge asshole.
He's like he's like does his own little genocide.
Yeah. No, the thing about this that's different from like you said, Tolkien being seen as commonplace is that this isn't the normative time travel situation. It's because it's kind of pre most time travel fiction. You're using this, like, Victorian, like, steampunk time machine, basically. What would today be registered as steampunk if it was made? You know what I mean?
Yeah, then it was just regular.
Yeah, exactly. So it's got that going for it, but it also means that, like, aspects of it that were later thought out really well are just not there. And yes, to return to what you were saying about the narrator, the Morlocks, he doesn't mean to kill all of them, but he's really glad when they die.
One thing you've said about Tolkien before is how, like, and it's true, I think, most of the time, that, like, evil races are bad. It's, like, explicitly bad. You know, at least in Tolkien, like, I can try and talk my way out of it, where it's like, well, actually they're clay. They're not even real because the guy that made them literally cannot create life. But of course, that just means that whoever the reader finds them analogous to, you know, that's what it's saying about them as far as the reader is concerned, right?
Yeah, it's like a placeholder that people fill in whether Tolkien wanted them to or not. Yeah.
Yeah. In this case, they're literally, as far as I can tell, the descendants of human beings. They have cultures, they have feelings, they have ideas that they're trying to do stuff about. I mean, obviously, what's her name? Wiener? What is it? Wiener. So a guy from Brooklyn saying Wiener.
A guy from Australia, in my case.
Wiener.
I had that. I heard him say Wiener a couple times when it was followed by a word beginning with a vowel.
Yeah, a Wiener. Dude, they really threw Wiener on a Barbie in this one.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So the evil races in this, they're just alive. They're like imagine if you watched Spirited Away and it was like a horror movie from the perspective of the little suit goblins that Chihiro steps on. Like like we get to see them eat a piece of candy and, like, have fun, like, at their job, and then they get stepped on and brutally murdered.
Yeah.
By, like, a figure from literally out of time. So yeah, I just had a hard time. Like, I mean, did you watch Game of Thrones?
No.
Okay, well, if you're listening, like, this to me was like if Game of Thrones was from like Ramsay Bolton's perspective.
I don't know who that is.
Ramsay, well, he's like just he's like a psycho. That's like his only thing.
Okay.
He just like flays people and cuts their body parts off and stuff. Like, I don't know. I just thought this, like, it was so weird to me that, like, yes, the narrator definitely is like H.G. Wells' like insert into the story. But
you mean the young narrator, the main narrator, the outside.
Oh, is that what you think? I kind of figured that it was the time traveler.
Time traveler is not
H.G.
H.G. Wells.
Socialism.
No, but H.G. Wells is an actual socialist. The time traveler again is like I said a little bit earlier. He's like an aristocrat who like maybe thinks socialism is inevitable, but he's a liberal. He's a capitalist. He has servants.
Okay. Yeah, so I guess he's not technically the point of view character, but he's the fucking main character of the book, and he's a psychopath. And I had so much trouble staying on board with this story while I was getting through it. Yeah. So that's where I'm at with that. Anyway, back to my list here. I really wanted to give kudos to H.G. Wells for saying very simple was my explanation and plausible enough as most wrong theories are. That was the thing that was another thing that kind of prompted me to ask you about your sensitivity to meta commentary. I'm sure like the weirdest fear was not the same back then as it is now, but I don't know, that line I really appreciated.
It's really good. He does remind you, even the narrator inside the story, who, and here is that, you know,
it was kind of like a butterfly dream thing, right?
Right, that could be a line that's because of the communistic bias of H.G. Wells's character, who doesn't want to accept some of the conclusions that the time traveler draws, or it could really be very literally what the time traveler said when he was telling the story, because the time traveler himself is a scientist, and despite his racist and classist biases, like, he does know that when it comes to explaining things, like, you know,
he has bias.
At least in the big picture, he might be totally wrong. You just don't know. He has very little data.
He understands that he's an unreliable narrator.
Yes, he does. Exactly.
So, yeah, just hallelujah. Oh, yeah, okay, so I'll just quote myself here instead of quoting H.G. Wells. The storyteller really seems to relish the battering of Morlocks. That it set me off so bad. Like, I don't know, it just seemed like he was like doing it the way that South Park kills Kenny or something. He's just bloodthirsty.
Yeah.
He at one point I clocked this. He stopped referring to it as a crowbar and started calling it a mace.
He's an aristocrat looking for an excuse to harm people who his ideology doesn't know how to deal with. And that's a really strong line of social commentary that Wells really develops alongside many other things
I wasn't expecting, or I decide when I read something this old, I can't say that, like, I'm inserting social commentary or whatever. I'm always assuming that it is an expression of the author and what they believe, you know. So I don't know, that might be my own biases putting me off. It certainly is, but it put me off all the same. I wasn't thinking, man, H.G. Wells is so based. I was thinking, H.G. Wells, like, keep him out of Africa. Don't let this book get into the hands of the crown.
There's a transcription linked in the article that I recommended you, which, by the way, let me just say the name of it so that it's at least in the episode.
I have it right here. It is Analysis of the Time Machine by Mar Gorshin. Yes.
So Gorshin, oh man, what was I gonna say? Gorshin basically gives H.G. Wells is so based.
That's-
He,
oh
what
no,
was
you're
you
just saying
saying?
that.
I
That's
can't
not him.
remember. I can't remember what you were saying now.
Me? I was saying I was reading this and I was like H.G. I was not thinking about how based H.G. Wells was. I was thinking about like he seems like he's kind of bloodthirsty a little bit.
Oh, okay.
He
Yeah.
would have been like a headhunter or something.
There's actually an interview later in H.G. Wells's life. Um, he sat down for a conversation with Joseph Stalin, and it's linked in that. It's a long conversation, and it's them like politely arguing about Stalin on the right, or not on the right. What am I saying? I meant to say on one side. I didn't mean for that to have political connotations, right? Stalin saying like full communism, and H.G. Wells being like, yes, but can't New Deal style, so like gradualism, social democracy get us to the same goal over time? So in a way, I think H.G. Wells kind of becomes the old man that maybe the time traveler is in this story. Although I would hope, and I have reason to believe, without the extreme class and racial biases. I'm not trying to absolve him of anything he might have said, but he's not the villain that this guy is in the story.
Yeah, I guess part of it's my fault for, well, all of it's my fault. I'm the one doing all the interpreting, but I didn't do my research on H.G. Wells. I should have, I guess. And this maybe is an exception and not the rule, that I can't apply like my modern point of view to a book that happened forever ago.
Yeah.
I don't know. I just don't have the benefit of having read this before, I guess. Having time to
Sure.
digest it and everything.
Right, and when I read it, I did a bunch of research right after I read it to find out.
I wasn't tempted. So I'm going to read some chapter 13.
Okay.
All right. I grieved to think how brief the dream of the human intellect had been. It had committed suicide. It had set itself steadfastly towards comfort and ease, a balanced society with security and permanency as its watchword. It had attained its hopes to come to this at last. Once life and property must have reached almost absolute safety. The rich had been assured of his wealth and comfort, the toiler assured of his life and work. No doubt in that perfect world there had been no unemployed problem, no social question left unsolved, and a great quiet had followed. It is a law of nature we overlook, that intellectual versatility is the compensation for change, danger, and trouble. An animal perfectly in harmony with its environment is a perfect mechanism. Nature never appeals to intelligence until habit and instinct are useless. There is no intelligence where there is no change and no need of change. Only those animals partake of intelligence that have met a huge variety of needs and dangers. So, as I see it, the upper world man had drifted toward his feeble prettiness, and the underworld to mere mechanical industry. But that perfect state had lacked one thing even for mechanical perfection, absolute permanency. Apparently, as time went on, the feeding of an underworld, however it was effected, had become disjointed. Mother Necessity, who had been staved off for a few thousand years, came back again, and she began below. The underworld being in contact with machinery, which, however perfect, still needs some little thought outside of habit, had probably retained perforce, rather than more initiative, if less of every other human character than the upper. And when other meat failed them, they turned to what old habit had hitherto forbidden. So I say I saw it in my last view of the world of 802,701. It may be as wrong an explanation as mortal wit could ever invent. It is how the thing shaped itself to me, and as that I give it to you. I was blown away. I love that. I thought that was some super effective writing. That's really like the meat and potatoes of this story to me. It really is just exposition. Is like a little bit of world building, and it happens right at the end. It's the filling between a very lopsided sandwich.
Yeah, and he actually gives you little spoonfuls of that filling earlier in the story, and then he's like, okay, maybe not, maybe that's a little bit wrong, and then he gives you another one, and he's like, maybe that's a little bit wrong, and then
Yeah,
you get to that at
that's
the end. He just puts it all. He puts together everything that he thinks happened in those like 3-4 paragraphs.
that's what I'm talking about. It's like I love so much to have a mystery unfold, and that to me was like Sherlock Holmes at the end when he's like,
That's how H.G. Wells figured out. H.G. Wells, by doing that, wrote a story that, without these devices in this particular way, risked being extremely pedantic, extremely just like dialectical. Like, oh well, don't you have these things in the future? No,
yeah,
like you know what I mean.
it's
Like he gives you so much richness of like this is how you might have actually heard the story from somebody that you knew or whatever. Like that it really and and because you're listening to somebody telling a story somebody else told, you also like you expect that kind of thing, that kind of summarizing. You know, how did
yeah,
this guy tell me how he thought through this process? It
yeah.
works so well.
So, something I feel like I've heard it out of. I feel like I heard it from George Martin. I have no idea where he got it from, but maybe it's his idea. I don't know. But he talks about like I'm forgetting what exactly he said, but I'm gonna go ahead and say like there's a difference between a planter and a harvester, right? As storytellers, like a planter like drops this thing in and is the person that takes care of it from seed germination into sprouting and being a plant. You build everything brick by brick and you get to the end of the story that way. And then you have the harvester who is like still of course a writer and an inventor in a way, but they have like an idea and then they go to the next one and then they go to the next one and by the end they've got all the ideas of the book. And I really love the way that H.G. Wells planted the story, and it's like almost he's figuring, like you say, he's figuring out for himself in real time what the story is, and
You're listening.
It's part of the story.
You're listening to somebody figuring out how to tell a story, and the story that they're telling is somebody figuring out how to tell a story, and the story that person is telling is them figuring out a world as they went through it, and you get also the feeling that H.G. Wells was kind of figuring out aspects of it as he went along.
That's exactly it's like the thing that I love about somebody like Arthur Conan Doyle, right? He comes up with this mystery, right? And it's not hard. Somebody like stabs somebody. That's the mystery. But the interesting part is that then he has to figure out like, oh, I deduced this, but actually I was wrong, and then so instead I should follow the other thread, and I love that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
so much.
Yeah, it's got a bit of mystery novel to it. The fact that it's also it's kind of anthropological, self-consciously.
Yeah,
even.
That's what I mean. I just wish I wish I could have felt that through the whole time instead of I get it at the end because like I finally don't hate the guy.
I think this is kind of a mood thing too. And the thing is, I don't think that guy's fully right? Like, but he acknowledges that he's not fully right. He acknowledges that he has biases, or he doesn't say I'm biased, therefore this. But he's not. He doesn't hide his biases that he brings to the world, right? He talks about them the whole goddamn time. He talks about the emotional reactions that he has and all this. So you see somebody struggling with this, and so he does come up with an interpretation which is both overall, I think, probably right, and has a conclusion, which is a scientist who is an aristocrat, went into the future and learned something poignant and horrible about the fucked up things about the world that I'm of my time and how it's going to develop. But I also still have all of those biases that were conditioned into me from the world that I live in, that I normally would not be critiquing in this way. Except in a very vague, it's about something that you only have vague conceptions about, that you're not really invested in, because again, he's also an aristocrat, suddenly being thrust at you and seeing the implications of the things that there are that now you are dealing with, being forced to see them, right? So the intriguing thing then is that if he's wrong, if the time traveler is wrong, and they're actually the Morlocks were just eating a deer or whatever, maybe they bite and attack, but they don't actually have any interest in the Eloi. If somehow all that is actually true and it was just his bias that made us and him think that, he still projected onto the world that he went to his deep fear or like unconscious things of like the contradictions of capitalism that he was not looking at in his own time. Do you know what I mean? Like he saw how bad it could get, even though he wasn't a communist. He wasn't again, he was kind of a theoretical social democrat. He wasn't really a communist. And now he's seeing this horrible reality. Interesting that he actually does not choose to stay in the reality when he comes back. It seems like it kind of got ruined for him. Because now once that dimension is opened up to you, that is just as real as where you are now. And I think that's the implication of what he's saying.
Oh my
is
God,
that
dude, you gotta watch Arrival. We got to do that before you go.
Wow. Okay, we'll do it.
I think we need to talk for a few minutes after the show.
Cool.
Yeah, another thing, I really appreciated the ending of this. I appreciate. Well, I don't know. Maybe did he write a sequel? I don't know.
I don't think so. No.
It was screaming sequel to me, and I was so satisfied that I didn't have to. I don't know. I love that it was. I love that there was another mystery at the end, without the first having been solved.
It could be that just a lot of great stories end on a mysterious note like that, and that like maybe the practice of writing sequels, part of the temptation comes from being like, man, why did I end it that way? Oh, everyone likes it. Maybe I should just kind of. Everyone asks me what happened. Oh, I'll just write what happened, and then boom, you're writing sequels.
I think maybe it was Poe. I think Poe's last story is like, is it unfinished or is this how it was, and he just hadn't started the next one yet. I'm fairly certain it's Poe. His one of his final stories ends in such a way that like, is this how the story ends, or
cool?
Was it just not finished? And then he went and said Croatoan and died.
His last words were Croatoan?
Allegedly, yeah.
What if he was gonna say Poatoan and then he just fucked it up?
He croaked.
Yeah.
We'll never know. Okay.
Croatoan. Okay.
I don't feel like we've gone quite crazy enough. At least not quite as crazy as maybe time travel asks us to go. So I wanted to end with the question that all great time travelers ask and have been asked. Would you rather go to the future or the past?
Would I rather go to the future or the past? I would rather go, I think, I was going to say future, but I'm kind of like, past. I think that I'm kind of, it's possible that we're actually closer to where time traveler goes 802,701, meaning that like if we go much farther forward,
I think it's pretty much 2020. I think that it was pretty much the year the apocalypse happened.
We go much farther forward, it's gonna, what he was really writing about was the acceleration of time. Yeah.
2020 was the backstory of this book. 2021 is when the story takes place.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So yeah, maybe I'd rather go to the past. There's some stuff I'd like to see. There's some languages I would like to hear spoken. There's some writing systems I would like to see, things like that.
I think the past might better suit my lifestyle.
If I could live forever and had a time machine, I would spend my time in the past. 100%.
So when do you think you might want to go? There's some big ones that people always hit on. People talk the Renaissance.
I want to go to Etruria, ancient Tuscany. I want to see the Tuscans. I want to go a little farther back. I want to ask them about their history, where they're from, how they got there. Trace that back.
I'd love to put some of my I'd love to put some weed in my backpack and go and talk to Confucius or Zhuangzi or something.
Yeah, I'd like to. If I had enough time, I would seek out mystics from all eras.
All the time. That's the thing.
Yeah. Oh
or
my
do you?
God.
I don't know.
Well, I think you might still age, but if you could not age, oh my God, the places I would go. I want to hear stories told. I want to go to a time. Just drop me somewhere, anywhere in the world, literally any community. Ask a storyteller to tell me a story about X thing. Go a little farther back. Ask about the same story. Go a little farther back. Ask about the same story, etc., etc., etc. Just do that for a story, and then go back to the present. Pick a different one and do the same thing. Pick a different one, do the same thing. That I would do.
Yeah, there's definitely some things I would like to verify. I also, it's a shame because obviously it's not possible. I'm not the time travel guy. I don't think that's happening. Or John Teeter can stay wherever he is. There's certain things like, I kind of want to know if Buddha was real. I want to know if Jesus was like really real and like walking the talk.
Right, was he one guy? Yeah.
But most of all, I think I would like to see like Rome on its very best day. If they can miss me with the future. I don't want to know where this goes. Like I'm already like, where's my stop?
Once you travel around in the past enough, I think that what happens is if you spend enough time in the past, you already have gone to the future.
Think about this though, right? You travel around the past long enough, you become like a legend. You are like the guy that's everywhere. You are like the flood myth made man,
What ends up happening is that if you go...
That's like Saint-Germain,
Who's Saint-Germain?
He's we'll talk about him next time.
Okay.
He's the Mount Shasta man. He's Rosicrucian stuff.
Yeah, like you become like the god of, like if I were to do that story thing that I said and just go to different places and like listen to a story, and then there would develop a parallel story that's associated with those stories of like the visitor, and then the visitor archetype would be like gradually incorporated into those stories and basically would become a god all over the world that happens to appear in a bunch of different myths and legends, and everyone would be like, I wonder what the shit that's about.
you become like a Prester John or the Wandering Jew. Like you become that person, but like really, right? Really, yeah. So yeah, it's the past for me.
Oh my god, that's so cool. There's more we could have said about the time machine, but I think we should just stop. That was really.
You still have an appendix you want to do?
We can do it later, honestly.
I mean, I don't want to do it today.
Yeah, me neither.
We already have some stuff that I think we probably should talk about.
Yeah, let's just talk.
Yeah. So anyway, that's The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. I think that's how he would want to say it. He was English.
That's true. His first name was H.
Yeah, H. John Benjamin. That sucks. We'll cut it in post. All right. Good night and good luck. Thank you for listening to Depth Perception. You can support us by subscribing to our YouTube channel, kicking us a little bit of scratch on Patreon.